The subtle acts of resistance begin to emerge. A quiet refusal to adopt their customs. A secret gathering to preserve your language and traditions. A whispered defiance against their authority. These are not open rebellions, not yet, but they are the first stirrings of a deep-seated resentment, a refusal to be completely subsumed by this foreign power. The spirit of your ancestors, the memory of a time when your people were truly free, flickers in the hearts of many. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood. If only for a moment. If these colonial doctors had a cure for everything, it would probably involve leeches and a very stern lecture about moral failings. Not exactly cutting-edge medicine, was it? Hey guys, tonight we're going to embark on a journey that spans oceans and centuries. A story woven into the very fabric of our modern world, yet one often told with a selective memory. We're going to delve into the sprawling, often unsettling truth about the British Empire's colonies. Forget the sepia-toned images of grand explorers and benevolent administrators. Tonight, you're going to experience it from a different perspective. You're about to step into a world where the promise of progress often masked a darker reality. A world where, let's be honest, your modern sensibilities would probably get you into a whole heap of trouble. Or worse, make you incredibly uncomfortable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The demographic catastrophe is staggering. Entire villages are decimated, their populations reduced to a fraction of their former size. The elderly, the very young, and the already weakened are often the first to succumb. The loss of so many people, particularly the elders who carry the wisdom of generations, and the children who represent the future, is an irreparable blow to your society. The social fabric unravels, communities are fractured, and the continuity of your culture is threatened. You stand on the sun-baked earth, the scent of unfamiliar spices heavy in the air, mingling with the distant sound of drums. Your village, nestled amongst lush greenery, has always been the center of your world. The rhythm of life here is dictated by the seasons, by the wisdom of your elders, by the ancient traditions passed down through generations. You know the land, its secrets, its bounties. Your community thrives on a delicate balance, a harmony with nature and with each other. But now a new element has entered this ancient tapestry, a thread woven from distant lands and alien intentions. The British colonial authorities, while sometimes attempting to implement rudimentary public health measures, are often overwhelmed by the scale of the epidemics, or simply prioritize economic interests over the well-being of the indigenous population. Their medical knowledge, while more advanced than traditional practices in some areas, is often insufficient to combat diseases they themselves introduced. Hospitals, if they exist, are few and far between, and often inaccessible to the local population. You first hear the whispers, carried by traders from the coast, tales of strange ships with immense white sails, larger than any you've ever seen. They speak of pale-skinned men, adorned in peculiar clothing, who arrive with gifts and promises. They offer trinkets of gleaming metal, cloth of vibrant colors, and tools that seem to defy the very laws of craftsmanship. Curiosity, mingled with a healthy dose of apprehension, begins to stir within your community. These newcomers are different, their ways enigmatic, their power undeniable. The academic debate still rages among historians was the demographic collapse of indigenous populations, primarily an unavoidable consequence of biological exchange during colonization. Or was it significantly exacerbated by the deliberate or negligent policies of the British Empire, such as forced labor, displacement, and the destruction of traditional livelihoods, which weakened resistance to disease? It's a complex question, exploring the interplay of biological factors and human actions in shaping historical outcomes. Then, they arrive. Not with an invading army, not at first, but with a quiet, almost insidious presence. A small group of them? Perhaps a handful of merchants, or a few men in uniform, their faces stern, their eyes assessing. They speak of trade, of mutual benefit, of bringing civilization and progress to your lands. They talk of roads, of schools, of new ways to cultivate the land and extract its riches. Their words are smooth, Their smiles disarming, and their promises sound enticing, especially to those who dream of a life free from the constant struggle against nature's whims. You witness the psychological toll of this constant death, the pervasive grief, the fear of contagion, the helplessness in the face of an invisible enemy it gnaws at your spirit. People become withdrawn, suspicious, their lives consumed by the struggle to survive and the endless cycle of mourning. The vibrant communal spirit, once a source of strength, is slowly eroded by the weight of collective trauma. You watch as they begin to establish themselves. A small trading post here, a rudimentary fort there. They bring their own laws, their own customs, their own way of doing things. At first, it seems harmless, even beneficial. New goods flow into your markets. New ideas are discussed. But beneath the veneer of cooperation, a subtle shift begins to occur. The balance of power, once held firmly by your elders and chiefs, slowly begins to tilt. Their gifts, you realize, come with unspoken expectations, their promises with hidden clauses. Another gentle joke. If these communities had a social media influencer, their main content would probably be avoiding cholera. Daily edition. Not exactly aspirational, but very practical. A common historical fact, often presented as a benevolent act, is the British Empire's claim of bringing civilization and development to its colonies. This often included introducing Western education, legal systems, and infrastructure like railways and telegraph lines. However, this development was almost always designed to serve the interests of the colonizers, facilitating the extraction of resources and the control of the local population, rather than genuinely improving the lives of the colonized people on their own terms. It was like someone building a super efficient highway through your backyard, but only so they could quickly drive away with all your valuables. The impact of these demographic shifts is profound and long-lasting. The loss of population weakens resistance to colonial rule, making it easier for the British to assert control over vast territories. The disruption of traditional labor patterns creates a vacuum that the British often fill with indentured laborers from other colonies, further complicating the social and ethnic landscape of your land. The very memory of the vibrant communities that once thrived begins to fade, replaced by the grim reality of a decimated population. And here's a unique detail that might make you raise an eyebrow in some early colonial encounters. The British would sometimes use elaborate, almost theatrical displays of their technological superiority to awe and intimidate local populations. This could involve firing cannons into the air, demonstrating muskets, or even showing off intricate clockwork mechanisms. The idea was to impress upon the indigenous people the overwhelming power and advanced nature of the British, making resistance seem futile before it even began. It was basically an early form of psychological warfare, like a really loud, flashy magic show designed to make you think they were wizards, not just guys with better guns. The British narrative often frames these population declines as an inevitable consequence of progress, or even as a sign of the inferiority of indigenous peoples, rather than acknowledging their own role in facilitating the spread of disease and undermining local health systems. This self-serving narrative seeks to absolve them of responsibility, to rationalize the immense suffering they inadvertently or directly caused. You begin to notice the subtle ways they assert their authority. They demand certain goods, certain concessions. They introduce new taxes, payable not in kind, but in their own currency, forcing you to engage with their economic system. They establish courts, staffed by their own people, where your traditional laws and customs hold little sway. Disputes that were once settled by your elders are now brought before these foreign judges, whose rulings often seem arbitrary and unjust. The sense of self-governance, once absolute, slowly erodes, replaced by an unfamiliar hierarchy. You see the remnants of once thriving villages, now overgrown with weeds, their empty huts a silent testament to the lives that were lost. The land, once bustling with activity, feels eerily quiet, haunted by the ghosts of those who succumbed to the invisible enemy. The very landscape seems to mourn the loss, its beauty tinged with a profound sadness. Your traditional leaders, once respected and powerful, find their authority undermined. The British bypass them, or worse, use them as puppets, granting them superficial power while stripping them of any real influence. You see the frustration in the eyes of your chiefs. the quiet despair as their people are increasingly drawn into the orbit of this new, dominant power. It's a slow, agonizing process of disempowerment, a gradual chipping away at the foundations of your society. The long-term consequences of this demographic catastrophe are immense. Even generations later, the populations of many former colonies will still be recovering from the devastating losses of this period. The loss of traditional knowledge, the disruption of social structures, and the enduring trauma of widespread death will cast a long shadow over their development and their struggle for self-determination. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood. If only for a moment. You know, if these colonial administrators had a motto, it would probably be, "We're here to help ourselves." Mostly. Very altruistic, indeed. Another gentle joke. If you tried to explain herd immunity to someone back then, they'd probably just look at you blankly and say, "Is that a new type of cattle disease?" Medical science was definitely still figuring things out. The arrival of missionaries follows closely on the heels of the merchants and soldiers. They speak of a new God, a different path to salvation. They build churches, establish schools, and preach a doctrine that often directly contradicts your ancient beliefs and spiritual practices. They tell you your traditions are primitive, your gods false, your way of life unenlightened. While some are genuinely well-intentioned, their efforts are often intertwined with the colonial agenda, serving to further undermine indigenous cultures and instill a sense of inferiority. It's a spiritual conquest, as potent and pervasive as the military one. As night falls, and the stars emerge, you lie in your cramped room, listening to the silence that has replaced the familiar sounds of your community. The fear of disease is a cold knot in your stomach, a constant companion that reminds you of your vulnerability. You close your eyes, but the images of the sick, the dying, and the endless graves persist. A haunting lullaby of the invisible war waged against your people. You feel the pressure to conform, to adopt their ways, to speak their language. Your children, once taught the stories of your ancestors, are now learning about distant kings and queens, about a history that is not your own. The vibrant tapestry of your culture, once so rich and diverse, begins to fray at the edges, threatened by the relentless tide of assimilation. It's a quiet violence, a slow erasure of identity, more insidious than any direct military confrontation. The journey into the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies continues, and you brace yourself for the next grim revelation, knowing that the wounds inflicted by disease are often the deepest and most enduring, shaping the very course of history in ways that are still felt today. The academic debate still swirls among historians. To what extent did the British Empire genuinely believe in its civilizing mission, viewing itself as a benevolent force bringing progress to backward peoples? Or was this narrative merely a convenient justification for economic exploitation and political domination? It's a complex question, weighing the stated intentions against the brutal realities and long-term consequences of colonial rule. The silent devastation of disease has swept through your communities, leaving behind a landscape of grief and diminished populations. But as the sun rises, casting its light upon a world forever altered, you begin to perceive a new, more insidious wound, one that cuts deeper than any illness and leaves scars on the very soul. It is the chilling reality of racial discrimination, a pervasive system that dictates your worth, your place, and your very destiny in the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies. The land itself, once yours to cultivate and cherish, begins to change hands. Through treaties, often misunderstood or outright coerced, vast tracts of territory are ceded to the British. They establish plantations, mines, and new industries, often displacing local communities and disrupting traditional land use patterns. You see your ancestral lands, once teeming with wildlife and vital for your sustenance, transformed into monocultures, producing raw materials for distant factories. The connection to the land, a spiritual and practical cornerstone of your existence, is severed. You've always known your people, your traditions, your unique place in the world. Your identity was clear, rooted in your lineage and your land. But with the arrival of the newcomers, a new hierarchy has been imposed, one based not on wisdom or skill or lineage, but on the color of your skin. You are no longer simply a person from your village. You are now categorized, labeled, and placed on a ladder where you are always irrevocably at the bottom. Another gentle joke. If you tried to explain colonialism to a child, you could say, "It's like when your friend comes over eats all your snacks, takes your toys, and then tells you how much better your house looks now that they've redecorated. And then they charge you for the redecoration. You see it in their eyes. The subtle shift from curiosity to condescension, from guarded respect to outright disdain. The pale-skinned colonizers, with their strange customs and their unwavering belief in their own superiority, view you as inherently lesser. They speak of natives, savages, uncivilized peoples, words that strip away your humanity and reduce you to something to be managed, controlled, or simply ignored. This dehumanization is the foundation of their power, making it easier for them to justify their exploitation and oppression. The sheer scale of the British Empire, the fact that it stretched across continents, is difficult to comprehend. From the scorching deserts of Africa to the humid jungles of Asia, from the vast plains of North America to the distant islands of the Pacific, the Union Jack flew over an astonishing quarter of the world's landmass. This vastness, however, was built on a foundation of control, extraction, and often brutal suppression. You are just one small part of this immense, interconnected web of power, a tiny thread in a global tapestry woven by force. The segregation is stark and undeniable. You are relegated to specific areas of the burgeoning colonial towns, often the most unsanitary and overcrowded. You are forbidden from entering certain establishments, from walking on certain streets, from sitting in certain places. There are separate schools, separate churches, separate facilities, all designed to reinforce the idea that you are fundamentally different and inferior. Even the air you breathe seems to be divided, with the clean, privileged air reserved for them and the dust-laden, polluted air for you. You begin to notice the subtle shift in attitudes. The initial curiosity and guarded respect from the British slowly morph into an air of superiority, even disdain. You are no longer seen as equals, but as subjects, as inferiors, as resources to be managed. The polite smiles become rarer, replaced by condescending gazes and curt commands. The promises of mutual benefit fade, replaced by the stark reality of domination. A common historical fact, often presented as a regrettable but perhaps inevitable aspect of colonial rule, is the pervasive system of racial segregation and discrimination implemented across the British Empire. This wasn't just informal prejudice. It was often codified into law, dictating where people could live, work, go to school, and even how they could interact with one another. The color of one's skin determined access to resources, opportunities, and justice, creating a rigid social hierarchy that benefited the colonizers at the expense of the indigenous population. It was like a global caste system, but instead of being born into it, you were born under it. The economic impact is profound. Your traditional industries, once vibrant and self-sufficient, are undermined by the influx of cheap manufactured goods from Britain. Local artisans struggle to compete, their livelihoods threatened. You are increasingly forced into a cash economy, dependent on wages from colonial enterprises, often paid too little to sustain your family. The self-sufficiency of your community, once a source of pride, slowly gives way to economic dependency. And here's a unique detail that highlights the absurdity of this racial hierarchy in some colonies, particularly those with mixed populations. Elaborate and often arbitrary systems of racial classification were developed, with specific terms for individuals of mixed heritage, each with its own set of prescribed rights and limitations. Imagine having a government official meticulously categorize your ancestry based on the perceived percentage of native or European blood, and then having your entire life's opportunities determined by that arbitrary label. It's like a very grim, bureaucratic version of a family tree, where branches were pruned based on skin tone. The British introduced new crops, new agricultural methods, often prioritizing cash crops like cotton, tea, or rubber for export, rather than food crops for local consumption. This shift, while profitable for the colonizers, makes your community vulnerable to famine if harvests fail or global prices fluctuate. You are no longer growing what you need to survive. You are growing what they need to profit. It's a dangerous gamble, and your life is the stake. Your traditional knowledge, once revered, is now dismissed as primitive superstition. Your language, once the vibrant pulse of your community, is ridiculed and suppressed. Your very appearance, your clothing, your hair, Your skin color, all are judged against their European ideals and found wanting. You are constantly made to feel ashamed of who you are, to aspire to be more like them, to shed your own identity in pursuit of an unattainable acceptance. This psychological warfare is deeply damaging, eroding your self-worth and instilling a sense of inferiority that can last for generations. You see the construction of new infrastructure roads, railways, ports. These are presented as signs of progress, of bringing modernity to your land, and indeed, they do facilitate movement. But you quickly realize their true purpose to efficiently transport raw materials from the interior to the coast, where they can be shipped to Britain, and to move troops quickly to quell any potential unrest. They are arteries of extraction, not necessarily arteries of local prosperity. You see your children, once proud and unburdened, begin to internalize these messages. They watch how you are treated, how their elders are dismissed, how their culture is devalued. They learn implicitly that their skin color is a mark of inferiority, that their heritage is something to be hidden or forgotten. The light in their eyes, once bright with curiosity, sometimes dims, replaced by a quiet resignation or a desperate longing to be seen as acceptable in the eyes of their oppressors. Another gentle joke. If the British Empire had a slogan for its infrastructure projects, it would be, "We build it so we can take your stuff faster." Efficiency, and here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood. If only for a moment. If these colonial administrators had a diversity and inclusion seminar, it would probably just be a slideshow of different shades of beige, with the caption, "See, we're very inclusive," of people who look vaguely like us. The legal system they impose, while claiming to be just, often serves to reinforce their power. Laws are enacted that favor British settlers and businesses, protecting their property and their interests over those of the indigenous population. Land disputes are often settled in their favor, traditional rights ignored, and dissent met with swift and severe punishment. Justice, you realize, is not blind. It wears a red coat and speaks with an unfamiliar accent. The economic impact of racial discrimination is profound. You are relegated to the lowest paying but most dangerous jobs, regardless of your skills or abilities. You are paid less than your European counterparts for the same work, often significantly less. Opportunities for advancement are virtually non-existent, blocked by an invisible but impenetrable barrier of racial prejudice. Your economic mobility is severely limited, trapping you in a cycle of poverty that seems impossible to break. You begin to understand the true nature of the civilizing mission. It is not about elevating your people to their level, but about transforming you into something useful for their empire. Your labor, your land, your resources, your very way of life are all to be molded and exploited for their benefit. The promises of progress are a thin veil, barely concealing the underlying agenda of control and extraction. The justice system, far from being blind, is deeply biased. If you are accused of a crime, your word holds little weight against that of a European. Punishments for indigenous people are often harsher, trials less fair, and legal recourse almost non-existent. You learn that justice is not universal. It is a privilege reserved for those with the right skin color. The law, which should protect all, becomes another tool of oppression, wielded to maintain the racial hierarchy. You look at the vast, sprawling map they bring, showing their empire painted in a bold, unwavering red. It stretches across the globe, an undeniable testament to their power. But as you gaze at it, you no longer see a symbol of progress or benevolence. You see a map of stolen lands, exploited resources, and subjugated peoples. You see the shadow of a vast, insatiable hunger that consumes everything in its path. The academic debate still rages among historians. Was the pervasive racism of the British Empire a primary driving force behind its expansion and exploitation, providing a moral justification for domination? Or was it a convenient ideology that emerged to rationalize existing economic and political power structures? It's a complex question. Exploring the chicken or egg relationship between prejudice and power, the sun begins to set, casting long crimson shadows across the land. The distant sound of drums, once a familiar comfort, now feels tinged with a new melancholy. You are caught between two worlds, the ancient rhythms of your ancestors and the relentless, unsettling pulse of the empire. The journey into the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies has only just begun. and you sense that the path ahead will reveal even more profound injustices and heart-wrenching stories. You witness the casual cruelty of everyday racism, the dismissive wave of a hand, the condescending tone of voice, the open mockery of your customs. These small acts, repeated endlessly, chip away at your dignity, leaving you feeling constantly on edge, constantly aware of your place. You learn to suppress your anger, to bite your tongue, to navigate a world where your very existence is seen as a problem to be managed. The sun rises, not with the gentle warmth of a new day in your ancestral lands, but with a harsh, glaring light that reveals the true nature of the changes unfolding around you. The whispers of trade and civilization have solidified into a grim reality the relentless, systematic extraction of your land's very essence. You've seen the ships arrive, laden with goods, but now you watch them depart, their holds bulging with something far more precious, something that once belonged to you. Another gentle joke. If these colonial powers had a customer service department, their motto would be, "Your call is important to us." Unless you're one of them. Then please hold indefinitely. The land itself, once a source of sustenance and spiritual connection, is now viewed through a different lens by the newcomers. It is not a living entity to be respected, but a vast, untapped reservoir of wealth. They speak of gold, of diamonds, of spices, of timber, of minerals, all the riches that lie beneath your feet or grow in your forests. Their eyes gleam with a hunger you recognize, but on a scale far grander and more terrifying than anything you've ever witnessed. The social consequences are devastating. Intermarriage is often forbidden or heavily discouraged, reinforcing racial purity. Social mixing between colonizers and colonized is limited, creating parallel societies that rarely intersect. This deliberate separation prevents understanding, fosters stereotypes, and entrenches prejudice, creating deep divisions that persist for generations. You live in the same land, but in entirely different worlds. You see the first signs of this insatiable appetite? Surveyors arrive, with their strange instruments and maps, meticulously charting every hill, every river, every patch of forest. They mark out territories, draw lines on paper that mean nothing to your people, but everything to them. Soon after, the digging begins. Not the gentle cultivation of your fields, but deep, scarring wounds torn into the earth. Mines appear like gaping mouths, swallowing men and resources into their dark depths. The rhythmic clang of pickaxes and the rumble of carts carrying away ore replace the familiar sounds of nature. Even acts of charity or benevolence are often tinged with racial superiority. The missionaries who offer education or medical aid often do so with the implicit expectation of cultural conversion. Viewing your traditional ways as inferior and in need of saving, the aid is not given as a right, but as a gift, reinforcing your perceived dependency and their inherent generosity. It's a subtle form of control, masked by good intentions. The forests, once a bountiful source of food, medicine, and shelter, are systematically felled. The sound of axes biting into ancient trees echoes through the valleys, followed by the crash of timber hitting the ground. Giant logs are dragged away, leaving behind barren clearings in a haunting silence where once there was vibrant life. You watch, helpless, as the very landscape that sustained your people for generations is transformed. Stripped bare to feed the insatiable demand of a distant empire, the impact of racial discrimination extends beyond the individual. It fragments communities, undermines traditional leadership, and creates internal divisions. Some indigenous people, seeking to gain favor or survive within the system, may adopt the colonizers' ways, leading to tensions and resentment within their own communities. The very fabric of solidarity is tested as people grapple with the impossible choices imposed by a discriminatory system. A common historical fact, often presented as a natural consequence of economic growth, is the British Empire's systematic exploitation of natural resources in its colonies. From the gold and diamonds of South Africa to the timber of Canada, the rubber of Malaya, the tea of India, and the minerals of Australia. Vast quantities of raw materials were extracted and shipped back to Britain to fuel its industrial revolution and enrich its coffers. This wasn't just trade. It was a one-sided transfer of wealth, often leaving the colonized lands depleted and impoverished. It was like a giant, global vacuum cleaner, sucking up everything valuable and leaving behind only dust. You see the long-term effects of this ingrained racism? Even after the colonial powers depart, the prejudice often lingers, casting a long shadow over newly independent nations. The racial hierarchies established during colonial rule can persist, shaping social structures, economic opportunities, and political power for decades, even centuries to come. The wounds of discrimination are not easily healed. They are passed down through generations, a bitter inheritance. And here's a unique detail that might make you ponder the sheer audacity in some resource-rich colonies. The British introduced highly specialized, often brutal, labor systems to maximize extraction. For example, in the diamond mines of South Africa, indigenous workers were often subjected to strip searches and even internal examinations to prevent them from smuggling diamonds, highlighting the extreme measures taken to secure every last gem. Imagine having your personal space invaded, not for security, but because they suspected you might have swallowed a diamond. It's a level of paranoia and control that borders on the absurd, if it weren't so demeaning. Another gentle joke. If these colonial powers had a diversity training program, it would probably just be a mirror. Look, you're diverse enough now, back to work. The labor itself is often coerced. Your people, once self-sufficient farmers and artisans, are now forced into working in these mines and plantations, often for pitiful wages, or sometimes no wages at all. The British introduced new forms of taxation, payable only in their currency, forcing you to earn money by working for them. Or they simply impose forced labor, backed by the threat of violence and imprisonment. You see men, women, and even children toiling under the scorching sun or in the dark. Dangerous depths of the earth, their bodies pushed to the breaking point. As night falls and the stars emerge, you lie in your cramped room, the weight of racial prejudice heavy on your spirit. You close your eyes, but the images of segregation, the sting of dismissive words, and the constant awareness of your otherness persist. The haunting truth of racial discrimination is not just a historical fact, it is a lived reality, shaping every aspect of your existence. A bitter reminder of the profound injustice that lies at the heart of the British Empire's colonial legacy. The traditional economic systems of your community are utterly disrupted. Your self-sufficiency, once a source of pride, crumbles under the weight of imported goods and the demand for cash. Local crafts and industries, unable to compete with the mass-produced goods from Britain, wither and die. You become dependent on the colonial economy, reliant on the wages they offer, trapped in a system where you produce raw materials for them and then buy back finished goods at inflated prices. It's a rigged game, and you are always on the losing side. The chilling reality of racial discrimination has settled over your land like a suffocating blanket, dictating every aspect of your existence. But as the seasons turn and the familiar rhythms of planting and harvest approach, a new, more immediate terror begins to grip your community. It is the gnawing emptiness of hunger, the desperate scramble for sustenance, and the terrifying realization that the very economic foundations of your life have been systematically dismantled. This is the disturbing truth of famine and economic collapse in the British Empire's colonies. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood, if only for a moment. You know, if these colonial powers had a business motto, it would probably be, we're not stealing your resources, we're just rehoming them to our homes, permanently. Very charitable of them. Wouldn't you say, you've always known the land, its cycles, its temperaments? Your ancestors taught you how to read the signs of the sky, how to coax life from the soil, how to store food for the lean times. Your economy was based on self-sufficiency, on growing what you needed, on bartering surplus, on a deep understanding of your local environment. But with the arrival of the colonizers, that intricate web of knowledge and practice has been severed, replaced by a system that prioritizes profit for a distant empire over the survival of your own people. The impact on your environment is devastating. The mining operations pollute your rivers, turning once clear waters into murky, toxic streams. The deforestation leads to soil erosion, turning fertile lands into barren wastes. The delicate ecological balance that your ancestors meticulously maintained for centuries is shattered in a matter of decades. The land, once your provider, becomes a victim, scarred and depleted, a silent testament to the relentless greed of the colonizers. The first signs of trouble are subtle, almost imperceptible. The British, in their relentless pursuit of raw materials for their industries, have encouraged, or outright forced, your people to shift from growing diverse food crops to cultivating monocultures of cash crops. Vast tracts of your most fertile land are now dedicated to cotton, or tea, or rubber, or opium. Commodities destined for distant markets, not for your own tables. You are told this is progress, that it will bring wealth. But as you look at the endless fields of a single crop, a cold dread begins to settle in your stomach. You see the wealth flowing out of your land, transported on ships that sail to distant shores. You watch as your own people grow poorer, their traditional livelihoods destroyed, their communities displaced. The riches of your land are not benefiting you. They are building grand cities and fueling industrial revolutions thousands of miles away. It's a stark visual representation of the injustice, a constant reminder of what has been taken from you. Then, the inevitable happens. A drought descends, longer and harsher than any you remember. Or perhaps a blight strikes the single crop you are now dependent on. Or, most insidiously, the global market price for that commodity crashes, thousands of miles away. A fluctuation you have no control over, no understanding of. Suddenly, the wealth you were promised evaporates. The cash you earned is now worthless. Unable to buy food that is no longer grown on your own land. The academic debate still rages among historians. To what extent did the British Empire's resource extraction policies contribute to the long-term underdevelopment and economic dependency of its former colonies? Even after independence, was it a necessary evil for global economic integration, or a deliberate act of systematic impoverishment that left lasting scars? It's a complex question, weighing the immediate gains for the colonizers against the enduring legacy of economic disparity. A common historical fact, often overlooked, is how colonial economic policies directly contributed to devastating famines in various parts of the British Empire, most notably in India. By forcing communities to shift from subsistence farming to cash crops for export, disrupting traditional food distribution networks, and implementing high land taxes, the British inadvertently or sometimes directly created conditions where millions died during periods of drought or crop failure. The food was often still being produced, but it was being exported, or the local population simply couldn't afford it. It was like living in a giant grocery store but you're only allowed to look at the shelves while everything is shipped overseas. The British introduced new agricultural methods, often monoculture, where vast tracts of land are dedicated to a single cash crop like cotton, tea, or sugar. While this increases efficiency for export, it makes your community incredibly vulnerable. If the global price of that single crop drops, or if a disease or natural disaster affects the harvest, your entire community faces ruin and famine. You are no longer growing diverse crops for your own sustenance. You are growing for the market, a market controlled by distant forces. And here's a unique detail that highlights the callousness of the system during some of the worst famines. While millions of indigenous people were starving, the British colonial administration continued to export grain and other food products from the affected regions, often to maintain supply for the British market or to feed their military. Imagine watching ships laden with food sail away from your starving village, a stark visual representation of the priorities of the empire. It's a level of indifference that truly chills you to the bone. Another gentle joke. If you asked a colonial administrator for a sustainable development plan, they'd probably just hand you a bigger shovel and point to the nearest gold mine. There's your sustainability, mate. The traditional systems of food storage and distribution, once robust and designed to weather lean times, have been dismantled. The granaries are empty, the communal stores depleted. The British, with their focus on individual ownership and market forces, have undermined the collective resilience of your community. Now, when disaster strikes, there is no safety net, no communal support to fall back on. Each family is left to fend for itself, a desperate struggle for survival. The system of land ownership is fundamentally altered. Communal lands once shared by your community are often privatized and sold off, sometimes to British settlers, sometimes to local elites who collaborate with the colonial power. This dispossesses your people, turning them into landless laborers, dependent on working for others on what was once their own land. It's a profound spiritual and economic loss, severing the deep connection between your people and the earth. You see the hunger in the eyes of your neighbors, in the gaunt faces of the children. Their bellies swell, their limbs thin. their skin becomes brittle. The cries of hungry infants pierce the night, a sound that tears at your heart. People begin to eat anything they can find: roots, leaves, insects, anything to stave off the gnawing emptiness. Desperation sets in, leading to desperate acts. Theft, once rare, becomes common. People abandon their homes, wandering in search of food, often dying by the roadside. You witness the arrogance of the colonial administrators and businessmen. They speak of empty lands or unused resources, completely disregarding the fact that these lands have been inhabited and managed by your people for millennia. They see only what they can take, not what already exists, not the intricate systems and cultures that have thrived there for centuries. Their vision is one of exploitation, masked by the rhetoric of progress. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood. If only for a moment. You know, if these colonial economists had a slogan, it would probably be, "We're not causing famine, we're just optimizing your agricultural output for our benefit." Very efficient, if you don't count the millions of dead. The environmental degradation is not just about resources, it's about the very air you breathe and the water you drink. Industrial processes, often unregulated, release pollutants into the atmosphere and waterways, leading to widespread health problems among the local population. The beauty of your natural surroundings, once pristine and vibrant, is slowly choked by the byproducts of extraction and industry. The economic collapse extends beyond agriculture. Your traditional crafts and industries, once vibrant and self-sufficient, have been crushed by the influx of cheap, mass-produced goods from Britain. Weavers, potters, blacksmiths. Their livelihoods are destroyed, their skills rendered obsolete. They are forced to abandon their trades and seek work in the colonial mines or plantations, adding to the desperate pool of cheap labor. The self-sufficiency of your community, once a source of pride, is replaced by utter dependency on a system that offers little security. The long-term consequences of this resource plunder are immense. Generations later, the land will still bear the scars of mining operations, the forest will still be diminished, and the rivers will still carry the residue of pollution. The economic dependency created by this system will persist, making it difficult for newly independent nations to truly control their own destinies. The wealth extracted from your land will continue to fuel the prosperity of others, leaving your own people struggling to rebuild from the foundations of depletion. The British introduced new forms of taxation, often payable in cash, regardless of whether your people have the means to earn it. If you cannot pay, your land can be seized, your property confiscated. This forces more people into wage labor, further entrenching the colonial economic system and making escape from the cycle of poverty even harder. It's a clever trap, isn't it? Create the problem, then offer the only solution, which also benefits you. You walk through the transformed landscape, past the mines and the clear-cut forests, and a profound sadness settles over you. The land, your mother, has been wounded, her bounty stripped away, her spirit diminished. You see the faces of your people, etched with the weariness of forced labor and the despair of dispossession. The promise of progress has turned into a bitter harvest, a testament to the disturbing truth of colonial greed. The academic debate continues among historians: to what extent were the famines in British colonies a direct result of colonial policies that prioritized imperial economic interests over local food security? Or were they primarily caused by natural factors like drought, with colonial administration merely failing to adequately respond? It's a complex question, weighing the culpability of human action against the forces of nature in shaping historical tragedies. As night falls, the sounds of distant machinery and the faint smell of industrial smoke drift on the wind. You lie down, but sleep offers little escape from the images of ravaged landscapes and exploited labor. The wealth of your land, once a source of life, has become a curse, binding you to a system that takes everything and gives back so little. The journey into the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies continues, and you brace yourself for the next grim revelation. You witness the social breakdown that accompanies widespread famine. Communities, once tightly knit, begin to unravel under the immense pressure. Families are torn apart as individuals leave in search of food, or as parents are forced to sell their children into servitude to save them from starvation. The moral fabric of society frays, replaced by a brutal struggle for individual survival. The very bonds that held your people together are stretched to their breaking point. The relentless grind of resource extraction continues, scarring the land and depleting its bounty. But as the sun arcs across the sky, casting long shadows over the transformed landscape, you begin to perceive a more insidious form of erosion. It's not just the physical environment that is being altered, it's the very soul of your people, the intricate tapestry of your culture that is slowly, subtly, being unraveled. The whispers of civilization and progress that once seemed benign now reveal their true, chilling intent, the systematic erasure of your identity. Another gentle joke. If these colonial administrators had a food security plan, it would probably involve a lot of spreadsheets showing export numbers, and zero actual food for the locals. Numbers look great. What's the problem? You've always known who you are. Your identity is woven into the stories told by your elders around the fire, in the songs sung during harvest, in the intricate patterns of your traditional clothing, in the rituals that mark the passage of life. Your language, rich with nuances and metaphors, connects you to your ancestors and to the land itself. Your spiritual beliefs, deeply rooted in the natural world, guide your actions and provide comfort in times of hardship. This is your heritage, your truth, your very essence. The British, in their attempts to alleviate famine, sometimes implement relief efforts, but these are often too little, too late, and poorly organized. The aid is often distributed through a system that reinforces colonial authority, or it is simply insufficient to address the scale of the crisis. The suffering continues, a stark indictment of a system that prioritizes profit over human lives. The perceived benevolence of the empire often rings hollow in the face of such widespread death. But the newcomers, with their stern faces and their unwavering conviction, see things differently. They view your traditions as primitive, your beliefs as superstitions, your language as a mere dialect, your way of life as backward. They believe with an almost zealous fervor that they are bringing you enlightenment, pulling you from the darkness of ignorance into the light of their superior civilization. This conviction, however well-intentioned it might sometimes appear, is a powerful weapon, more devastating than any musket. The long-term consequences of these famines and economic collapses are immense. Generations are scarred by the trauma of starvation and loss. The economic dependency created by colonial policies persists long after independence, making it difficult for newly sovereign nations to build robust, self-sufficient economies. The memory of hunger becomes a collective trauma, shaping the political and social landscape for centuries to come. You see the first signs of this cultural assault in the schools they establish? These are not places where your children learn the wisdom of your ancestors. They are institutions designed to transform them. Your children, once taught the stories of your creation and the practical skills for survival in your environment, are now learning about distant kings and queens, about a history that is not their own, about a God who resides in a faraway heaven. They are taught to read and write in the language of the colonizers, while your own tongue, once the vibrant pulse of your community, is slowly relegated to the shadows. You walk through the devastated landscape, past fields that lie barren, past villages where silence has replaced the sounds of life. The air, once filled with the promise of harvest, now carries the stench of death and despair. You see the hollow eyes of the survivors, their bodies frail, their spirits broken. The land, once bountiful, has been bled dry, its people sacrificed on the altar of imperial greed. A common historical fact, often presented as a benevolent act of education, is the widespread establishment of mission schools and colonial education systems. While these schools did provide literacy and numeracy skills, their primary purpose was often to assimilate indigenous populations into Western culture, promoting Christianity, European values, and the English language, while actively suppressing local languages, religions, and traditions. It was like offering someone a new, shiny toy, but only if they threw away all their old, beloved ones. Another gentle joke. If these colonial powers had a slogan for their economic policies, it would be, "We're not taking your wealth, we're just reallocating it to a bank account with a much nicer view." And here's a unique detail that highlights the almost absurd lengths to which this cultural suppression went in some mission schools. Indigenous children were not only forbidden from speaking their native languages, but they were also punished for doing so, sometimes even physically. Imagine being a child, desperate to communicate with your friends and family. But knowing that a single word in your mother tongue could earn you a beating? It's a chilling reminder of the psychological warfare waged against cultural identity, turning language, a tool of connection, into a source of fear. As night falls and the stars emerge, you lie in your cramped room, the gnawing ache of hunger a constant companion. You close your eyes, but the images of starving children, of empty fields, and of the ships laden with your stolen bounty persist. The haunting truth of famine and economic collapse is not just a historical fact. It is a lived reality, shaping every aspect of your existence. A bitter reminder of the profound injustice that lies at the heart of the British Empire's colonial legacy. The journey into this disturbing truth continues, and you brace yourself for the next grim revelation, knowing that the wounds inflicted by economic exploitation are often the deepest and most enduring. Your traditional ceremonies, once vibrant and central to your community life, are discouraged, sometimes even outright forbidden. The rhythmic drumming, the sacred dances, the ancient songs all are viewed with suspicion, dismissed as pagan rituals or even perceived as acts of rebellion. The missionaries preach against your spiritual leaders, against your ancestral gods, telling you that your path to salvation lies only through their faith. You see the confusion in the eyes of your elders, the quiet despair as their sacred practices are demonized and suppressed. The gnawing emptiness of famine and the brutal reality of economic collapse have left your communities devastated, their spirit tested to the very limits of endurance. But as the sun rises, casting its light upon a land scarred by exploitation and hunger, you begin to hear something new, something that has been suppressed for far too long. It is the faint, yet growing, chorus of resistance, the stirring of a defiance that refuses to be silenced by hunger, disease, or the barrel of a gun. This is the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies, where even in the darkest hours, the human spirit finds a way to fight back. The very fabric of your social structure begins to fray. The authority of your chiefs and spiritual leaders, once absolute, is undermined by the colonial administration. They introduce new legal systems, new forms of governance, which often contradict your traditional ways of resolving disputes and maintaining order. The old ways, once respected and understood, are now dismissed as inefficient or unjust, replaced by a foreign system that you struggle to comprehend. You've lived under the yoke of colonial rule, witnessed the systematic plunder of your resources, the erosion of your culture, the brutal violence, the ravages of disease, and the crushing weight of racial discrimination. For generations, the sheer struggle for survival consumed all your energy, leaving little room for anything but the grim determination to simply exist. But now, a profound shift is occurring. The despair, while still a heavy presence, is slowly giving way to a nascent anger, a quiet indignation that demands action. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood. If only for a moment, if these colonial powers had a cultural exchange program, it would probably be a one-way ticket. We'll take your gold, and you can have our very stern lectures on proper etiquette. It begins subtly, in the hushed conversations around meager fires, in the shared glances of understanding between weary laborers. A whispered complaint about the injustice of a new tax, a shared memory of a time when your people were truly free, a grim joke about the arrogance of the colonizers. These are not just individual laments anymore. They are becoming collective expressions of a shared plight, a common grievance that binds you together. There's a sense of validation in knowing you are not alone in your suffering, that others feel the same burning injustice. Your traditional clothing, once a source of pride and a marker of identity, is often deemed uncivilized or immodest. You are encouraged, sometimes forced, to adopt Western attire, to abandon the vibrant colors and intricate patterns that tell the story of your people. Your traditional art forms, your music, your storytelling all are slowly pushed to the margins, replaced by European forms of expression. It's a slow, insidious process of cultural homogenization, a quiet violence that aims to make you more like them and less like yourselves. The traditional leaders, those who still hold sway despite the colonial efforts to undermine them, play a crucial role. They gather their people in secret, away from the prying eyes of the colonial authorities. They remind you of your heritage, of the strength of your ancestors, of the injustices you have endured. They speak of unity, of the need to resist, of the dream of a future where your people are once again masters of their own destiny. Their words, delivered with quiet authority, ignite a spark of hope in the hearts of many. The academic debate still rages among historians: was the cultural impact of colonialism an inevitable byproduct of contact between different civilizations, with some degree of cultural exchange always occurring? Or was it a deliberate and systematic attempt by the British Empire to impose its own cultural hegemony and erase indigenous identities as a means of control? It's a complex discussion, weighing the forces of globalization against the specific policies of cultural suppression. A common historical fact, often overlooked in the simplified narratives of colonial rule, is that resistance to the British Empire was constant and multifaceted, ranging from subtle acts of non-compliance to large-scale armed rebellions. It was never a story of passive acceptance. Indigenous populations, despite overwhelming odds, continuously found ways to challenge, undermine, and resist colonial authority, demonstrating remarkable resilience and ingenuity. It was less about a single grand uprising and more about a persistent, often underground, war of attrition. You feel the weight of this cultural loss, a profound sense of emptiness where once there was richness and vibrancy. Your children, growing up in this new world, are caught between two cultures, often feeling alienated from both. They speak the language of the colonizers, but struggle to connect with the wisdom of their grandparents. They learn about distant lands, but lose touch with the sacred stories of their own soil. It's a generation adrift, their roots severed, their identity fragmented. And here's a unique detail that highlights the ingenuity of early resistance in some regions. Indigenous populations developed sophisticated systems of coded messages, oral traditions, and even symbolic art to communicate plans for rebellion, or to preserve cultural knowledge without alerting colonial authorities. Imagine using the patterns in a woven basket, or the rhythm of a seemingly innocent song, to transmit vital information about an upcoming uprising. It's a testament to the power of human creativity in the face of oppression, turning everyday objects into tools of defiance. Another gentle joke. If these colonial powers had a reality TV show, it would be called Extreme Makeover Cultural Edition. And the grand prize would be, well, probably just more colonialism. The first acts of organized resistance are often small, localized, and met with brutal repression. A refusal to pay taxes, a boycott of British goods, a collective slowdown of work in the mines or plantations. These acts, though seemingly minor, are significant because they represent a collective challenge to the colonizers' authority. You witness these acts of defiance and the swift, often violent, response from the colonial military. Leaders are arrested, villages are burned, and the message is clear: the empire will tolerate no challenge to its power. The colonial narrative, propagated through schools, newspapers, and official decrees, constantly reinforces the idea of British superiority and indigenous inferiority. You are taught that your history is insignificant, your achievements negligible, your very existence a testament to the need for their guiding hand. This psychological warfare, this constant undermining of your self-worth, is perhaps the most damaging aspect of cultural erasure. It aims to break your spirit, to make you believe that you are indeed lesser, and thus deserving of your subjugated status. But even in the face of such brutality, the spirit of resistance is not extinguished. The seeds of discontent have been sown, and they continue to germinate, slowly, beneath the surface. The shared experience of repression only strengthens the bonds between those who resist, fostering a deeper sense of solidarity. They learn from their failures, adapt their strategies, and continue to seek ways to challenge the oppressive system. The memory of those who fell in defiance becomes a rallying cry, a reminder of the sacrifices made for freedom. You see the subtle acts of resistance, the quiet defiance that keeps your culture alive. An elder secretly teaching children the forbidden stories. A woman weaving traditional patterns into a hidden part of her garment. A hushed song sung in the dead of night. A melody that carries the weight of generations. These are not grand rebellions, but vital acts of preservation. Sparks of defiance that refuse to let the flame of your culture die out completely. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood, if only for a moment. You know, if these colonial powers had a suggestion box for their subjects, it would probably be filled with notes saying, Please leave. Go home. And seriously, just go. And then they'd just throw it in the nearest ocean. The missionaries, while often bringing medical aid and some forms of education, are also agents of cultural change. They condemn polygamy, traditional healing practices, and indigenous forms of social organization, imposing their own moral and social norms. This creates deep divisions within communities, pitting converts against those who cling to the old ways, further weakening the social cohesion that once defined your people. The forms of resistance are diverse. Some turn to spiritual movements, seeking solace and strength in renewed religious fervor, often blending traditional beliefs with elements of the new faith to create a powerful, unifying ideology of liberation. Others engage in cultural resistance, secretly preserving their languages, their stories, their ceremonies, ensuring that the flame of their heritage continues to burn, even in the darkest of times. These acts of cultural preservation are often as powerful as any armed rebellion, for they keep the very essence of a people alive. The very landscape, as it is reshaped by colonial exploitation, also loses its cultural significance. Sacred sites are desecrated by mining operations or turned into plantations. Traditional hunting grounds are fenced off. The spiritual connection to the land, once so profound, is severed as the physical environment is transformed beyond recognition. The land no longer speaks to you in the same way. Its ancient voices muffled by the clamor of industry, the academic debate still rages among historians. Were the early forms of resistance to the British Empire primarily driven by a desire to return to pre-colonial ways of life? Or were they forward-looking movements that sought to forge new, independent nations with elements of both traditional and modern governance? It's a complex question, exploring the motivations and visions of those who fought against colonial rule. Another gentle joke. If these colonial powers had a cultural appreciation department, it would probably just consist of a guy in a pith helmet pointing at a traditional artifact and saying, interesting. Now, how can we sell this back home? You hear stories of legendary figures, individuals who dared to stand up against the might of the empire, a chief who refused to sign a coercive treaty, a spiritual leader who inspired acts of defiance, a warrior who led a small but courageous rebellion. These stories, passed secretly from mouth to mouth, become powerful symbols of hope and inspiration, reminding your people that resistance is possible, that even the smallest act of defiance can ignite a larger movement. The long-term consequences of this cultural erasure are immense. Even after independence, the scars remain. The loss of language, the fragmentation of traditional knowledge, the lingering sense of cultural inferiority, these are burdens that generations will carry. The struggle to reclaim and revitalize lost identities becomes a central challenge for post-colonial nations, a testament to the enduring power of culture and the profound damage inflicted when it is suppressed. Another gentle joke. If these colonial resistance fighters had a band, their hit single would probably be called No More Tea and No More Taxes. It would be a real chart topper in the underground scene. You walk through your village, now a shadow of its former self, and a profound sadness settles over you. The vibrant colors have faded, the ancient songs are sung more softly, the stories told more secretly. The laughter of the children, once unburdened, now carries a faint echo of the foreign tongue they are forced to learn. You are living through a slow, agonizing death of a way of life. A cultural genocide waged not with guns, but with textbooks, sermons, and decrees. The British, in their attempts to quell dissent, often resort to more sophisticated tactics. They employ informants, infiltrate resistance groups, and use propaganda to sow discord and distrust among the local population. They try to divide and conquer, exacerbating existing ethnic or religious tensions, turning one group against another to weaken any unified front. You learn to be cautious, to trust only those who have proven their loyalty, to navigate a world where betrayal can come from unexpected quarters. As night falls and the stars emerge, you look up and try to find comfort in the constellations your ancestors knew. But even the sky feels different now, somehow diminished by the weight of what has been lost. You close your eyes and you see the faces of your people, their traditions slowly fading, their voices growing quieter. The journey into the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies continues, and you brace yourself for the next grim revelation. knowing that the wounds inflicted on the soul are often the deepest and most enduring. But despite these efforts, the spirit of nationalism begins to awaken. The shared experience of oppression, the common enemy, begins to forge a new sense of identity, a collective consciousness that transcends tribal or regional loyalties. You are no longer just a person from your village, you are part of a larger people, a nation struggling for its freedom. This nascent nationalism becomes a powerful force, uniting disparate groups under a common banner of liberation. The cultural erosion continues, a slow, insidious process that gnaws at the very soul of your people. But as the sun beats down, casting harsh shadows across the land, a new, more visceral reality emerges from the shadows of subtle control, the undeniable, brutal force of the British Empire's military might. The whispers of civilization and progress are now drowned out by the clang of steel, the bark of orders, and the chilling crack of musket fire. You're no longer just witnessing cultural suppression, you are facing outright violence and ruthless oppression. The resistance movements, though often fragmented and lacking resources, learn to adapt. They employ guerrilla tactics, striking swiftly and disappearing into the landscape they know so intimately. They exploit the vastness of the land, the unfamiliar terrain, and the local knowledge that the British, despite their superior technology, often lack. The struggle becomes a war of attrition, a test of wills, where the determination of the colonized slowly begins to wear down the resolve of the colonizers. You've seen their soldiers before, and of course, they arrived with the merchants and missionaries, their uniforms crisp, their weapons gleaming. At first, their presence was a display of power, a silent warning. But now, that warning has become a stark, terrifying reality. The soldiers are everywhere, patrolling the streets of your transformed village, guarding the mines and plantations, their eyes cold and unyielding. Their presence is a constant reminder that this land, once yours, is now under their absolute control, maintained by the barrel of a gun. You see the sacrifices made by those who resist, the imprisonment, the torture, the executions. Entire families are punished for the actions of one rebel. The cost of defiance is immense, yet still, people rise up, driven by a desperate longing for freedom, a profound belief in the justice of their cause. Their courage is a testament to the indomitable human spirit, its refusal to be completely crushed, even under the most brutal conditions. The slightest perceived transgression can trigger a swift and disproportionate response. A refusal to obey an order, a protest against a new tax, a gathering that seems too large or too defiant, any of these can be met with brutal force. You witness it firsthand, a group of villagers, desperate and hungry, attempting to reclaim a small patch of their ancestral land that has been fenced off for a new plantation. The soldiers arrive, not with words, but with bayonets and muskets. The screams are quickly silenced, the ground stained with blood, and the message is chillingly clear: resistance is futile, and disobedience will not be tolerated. Another gentle joke. If these resistance movements had a slogan for their recruitment posters, it would be, "Join us, we have very little, but also freedom." Maybe. It was a tough sell, but they made it work. A common historical fact, often downplayed in imperial narratives, is the sheer brutality with which the British Empire maintained control over its vast territories. While often portrayed as a civilizing force, the Empire frequently resorted to overwhelming military force to suppress rebellions, enforce unpopular policies, and secure economic interests. Massacres, punitive expeditions, and collective punishments were not uncommon, serving as stark deterrents to any form of dissent. It was less about winning hearts and minds, and more about breaking spirits and bodies. Think of it as a very aggressive peacekeeping mission, where peace meant absolute submission. The international context also begins to shift. News of the brutal realities of colonial rule slowly reaches other parts of the world, sparking sympathy and support for the resistance movements. Anti-colonial sentiments begin to grow in Britain itself, as some voices within the empire question the morality and sustainability of their vast dominion. These external pressures, combined with the relentless internal resistance, begin to put immense strain on the British Empire, forcing it to confront the true cost of its colonial ambitions. And here's a unique detail that highlights the psychological aspect of this oppression in some instances. The British would conduct public executions or floggings for even minor offenses, not just to punish the individual, but to serve as a terrifying spectacle for the local population. Imagine seeing a fellow villager publicly humiliated or executed for something as minor as stealing a loaf of bread, all designed to instill fear and discourage any thoughts of rebellion. It was a macabre form of public education, teaching obedience through terror. It's like a very grim school assembly, where the lesson was, don't mess with the empire. As night falls and the stars emerge, you lie in your cramped room, the sounds of distant resistance echoing in your mind. The path to freedom is long and arduous, fraught with danger and sacrifice. But for the first time, you feel a profound sense of hope, a belief that your voice, combined with the voices of countless others, can eventually break the chains of oppression. The whispers of defiance have grown into a murmur. And one day, you believe, that murmur will swell into a roar that can no longer be silenced. The fight for a better future has begun, one weary, defiant step at a time. A testament to the enduring power of the human will to resist tyranny. The weapons they wield are far superior to anything your people possess. Their muskets fire with a deafening roar, sending lead balls tearing through flesh. Their cannons, though rarely used against unarmed villagers, are a terrifying symbol of their destructive power. You've seen the devastating impact of their firepower, the ease with which they can mow down a crowd, leaving behind a trail of death and despair. It's a stark reminder of the technological disparity, a gap that seems insurmountable. The chorus of resistance, once a faint whisper, has swelled into a determined murmur, echoing across your land. You've witnessed the sacrifices made, the battles fought, the enduring spirit of your people in the face of overwhelming odds. But as the sun casts long shadows across the landscape, revealing the scars of exploitation and the resilience of defiance, you begin to understand that even as the grip of the British Empire loosens, its presence leaves behind a profound and painful legacy. This is the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies, where the wounds inflicted by imperialism continue to fester long after the colonizers have departed. The soldiers themselves are often young, hardened by war, and trained to obey orders without question. They view the local population with a mixture of suspicion, disdain, and sometimes outright contempt. They are taught to see you as natives, as inferiors, as obstacles to the Empire's progress. This dehumanization makes it easier for them to carry out their brutal duties, to inflict violence without remorse. You feel their cold stares, their dismissive gestures, their unwavering belief in their own superiority. You've seen the physical scars on the land, the open pits of abandoned mines, the barren stretches where forests once thrived, the polluted rivers that no longer sustain life. These are visible reminders of the relentless plunder, the insatiable hunger for resources that left your environment depleted and damaged. Even with the colonizers gone, the land itself bears the marks of their presence, a silent testament to the violence of extraction. The ecological balance, once meticulously maintained by your ancestors, is shattered, and the task of healing the earth falls to a generation burdened by scarcity. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood. If only for a moment, you know. If these colonial soldiers had a Yelp review for their job, it would probably say, great benefits power, control. But the locals are a bit uncooperative, needs more tea. The economic wounds are perhaps even deeper. Your traditional industries, once vibrant and self-sufficient, were systematically dismantled, unable to compete with the influx of cheap manufactured goods from Britain. Your people, once independent farmers and artisans, were forced into wage labor, dependent on a colonial economy that prioritized cash crops for export over food for your own tables. Now, with independence, you inherit an economy designed to serve external masters, not your own people. The infrastructure built by the British railways, ports was designed to extract resources, not to foster internal trade or industrial development. You are left with a broken economic system, a legacy of dependency that makes true self-sufficiency a distant dream. The concept of justice, as you knew it, ceases to exist. The colonial courts, staffed by British officials, rarely side with the indigenous population. Accusations are often taken as fact. Evidence is disregarded, and punishments are severe. Imprisonment, forced labor, and even execution are common sentences for those who dare to challenge the colonial authority. You learn to fear their laws as much as their weapons, knowing that their justice is designed to maintain their power, not to protect your rights. A common historical fact, often highlighted in post-colonial studies, is the concept of economic dependency that persisted long after formal independence. Many former colonies found themselves still reliant on their former colonial masters for trade, investment, and technology, often continuing to export raw materials at low prices and import manufactured goods at high prices. This perpetuated a cycle of underdevelopment, making it incredibly challenging for newly independent nations to achieve genuine economic sovereignty. It was like finally getting your own house, but realizing all the furniture was bolted to the floor and only faced the old landlord's house. The suppression extends beyond overt violence. Censorship is imposed, preventing the spread of any ideas that might challenge colonial rule. Public gatherings are restricted, and any form of organized dissent is met with swift action. Spies and informants, often drawn from the local population, are used to root out potential rebels, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust within your own community. You learn to be careful with your words, to trust no one, to keep your true feelings hidden deep within. And here's a unique detail that illustrates this economic legacy in some former British colonies. The legal and financial systems established by the British, including land ownership laws and banking structures, continue to favor a small elite or foreign corporations, making it difficult for the majority of the indigenous population to access capital or build wealth. Imagine trying to start a small business, but all the banks are designed to only lend money to the descendants of the colonial administrators, or to companies based in London. It's a subtle yet powerful form of continued control. Long after the flags have been lowered, the academic debate continues among historians. Was the British Empire's reliance on brutal force a sign of its inherent weakness and insecurity, needing constant violence to maintain control? Or was it a calculated and effective strategy for managing vast and diverse populations with minimal resources, ensuring compliance through fear? It's a question of whether the violence was a last resort or a primary tool of governance. The social fabric of your communities has also been profoundly altered. The British policy of divide and rule, which exacerbated existing ethnic and religious tensions, has left behind deep-seated animosities and conflicts. Artificial borders, drawn by colonial administrators with little regard for indigenous communities, have created nations composed of disparate groups, often with little shared history or common purpose. You see the lingering distrust, the occasional outbreaks of violence between groups who once coexisted, a bitter inheritance of imperial manipulation. You witness the psychological toll of this constant oppression. The fear is palpable, a heavy blanket that smothers any spark of joy or hope. People become withdrawn, their faces etched with resignation. The spirit of defiance, though still flickering, is often forced underground, expressed only in hushed tones and secret gatherings. The constant threat of violence creates a pervasive sense of helplessness, a feeling that you are trapped in a cage with no visible escape. The education system, designed to create a class of clerks and administrators loyal to the empire, has left many without the practical skills needed for self-governance or industrial development. While some received a Western education, it often came at the cost of their traditional knowledge and connection to their own culture. You are left with a system that produced a few elites, but failed to empower the majority, creating new social divisions within your own society. Another gentle joke: if these colonial administrators had a suggestion for a new national sport, it would probably be suppressing dissent. And they'd be really good at it, too. And here's a gentle joke to try and lighten the mood. If only for a moment. You know, if the British Empire had a leaving gift for its colonies, it would probably be a very complicated, self-assembling flat-pack furniture set with no instructions and half the pieces missing. Good luck with that, chaps. The British also employed a strategy of divide and rule, exacerbating existing tensions between different ethnic or religious groups within the colony. By favoring one group over another, or by creating artificial divisions, they weakened any potential unified resistance. This often led to long-lasting conflicts and animosities that persisted long after the British departed, a bitter legacy of their manipulative tactics. You see your own community, once relatively cohesive, becoming fractured by these imposed divisions. The psychological scars are perhaps the most insidious. Generations have grown up under a system that constantly reinforced their inferiority. that devalued their culture, their language, and their very identity. The internalized racism, the sense of being less than, is a heavy burden that persists long after the colonizers have departed. You see it in the lingering self-doubt, the struggle to reclaim a sense of pride and self-worth, the ongoing battle against the echoes of colonial narratives that still whisper in the minds of many. The concept of civil liberties or human rights is entirely absent. You have no right to free speech, no right to assembly, no right to due process. Your life, your property, your very existence are subject to the arbitrary will of the colonial authorities. You are not citizens, you are subjects, and your purpose is to serve the empire. This fundamental lack of rights is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of colonial rule, reducing individuals to mere instruments of imperial ambition. The political institutions left behind are often fragile and ill-suited to the diverse realities of the newly independent nations. Parliamentary democracies, imposed by the British, often struggle to take root in societies with different historical traditions and social structures. The legacy of authoritarian rule, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few colonial administrators, can lead to new forms of authoritarianism, as newly independent leaders struggle to consolidate power and maintain order. The path to stable democratic governance is often fraught with challenges, a direct consequence of the colonial legacy. The violence is not always direct. Sometimes it's the slow, agonizing death of starvation caused by colonial economic policies. Sometimes it's the pervasive illness that sweeps through overcrowded, unsanitary slums. Sometimes it's the quiet despair of a culture being systematically erased. But always underlying these forms of suffering is the implicit or explicit threat of force, the knowledge that the British military stands ready to crush any true challenge to their authority. The academic debate continues among historians to what extent did the British Empire's legacy, despite its undeniable harms, also leave behind certain positive contributions, such as legal systems, administrative structures, or modern infrastructure, which some post-colonial nations were able to adapt and utilize for their own development. Or do these perceived benefits merely serve to obscure the deeper, more pervasive damage inflicted by colonial rule? It's a complex and often contentious discussion, weighing the good against the bad in a deeply intertwined history. You see the scars of this violence on the land itself. The burned villages, the desecrated sacred sites, the mass graves that bear silent witness to forgotten atrocities. These are not just historical footnotes. They are living wounds, etched into the landscape and into the collective memory of your people. The land remembers, even if the conquerors try to forget. You witness the struggle to reclaim and revitalize lost cultural identities, the efforts to revive traditional languages, to celebrate suppressed ceremonies, to tell your own stories in your own voices. It is a slow, arduous process, often met with resistance from those who have internalized colonial values, or from the lingering divisions created by imperial policies. But it is a vital struggle, a necessary step towards healing the wounds of cultural erasure and forging a new, authentic identity. Another gentle joke. If you asked a colonial general for a peace treaty, he'd probably just offer you a very large, very sharp bayonet. Here's your peace, mate. Now sign here. Another gentle joke. If these post-colonial nations had a support group, their opening line would be, "Hi, my name is country name, and I'm recovering from a very long, very complicated relationship with Britain." As night falls and the stars emerge, you lie in your cramped room, listening to the distant sounds of military patrols. The fear is a cold knot in your stomach, but beneath it, a tiny spark of defiance glows. You have witnessed the brutality, felt the weight of oppression, but you have also seen the quiet courage of your people, their unwavering spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The fight for freedom, though dangerous and uncertain, is a testament to the indomitable human will to resist tyranny. The issue of historical memory is a constant challenge. How do you remember the past? Do you focus on the progress and development, or on the exploitation and suffering? Do you forgive, or do you demand justice? The narratives of colonialism are often contested, with different groups holding vastly different interpretations of the past. This struggle over historical memory is not just an academic exercise. It is a fundamental part of nation building, of coming to terms with a traumatic past and forging a collective future, you close your eyes. But the images of violence persist: the glint of bayonets, the flash of musket fire, the faces of those who dared to resist. The journey into the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies continues, and you brace yourself for the next grim revelation, knowing that the fight for dignity and freedom is often paved with immense suffering and unimaginable courage. The brain drain, a phenomenon where educated individuals from former colonies migrate to former colonial powers for better opportunities, is another enduring legacy. The education systems, often designed to produce graduates who fit into the colonial administrative structure, may not align with the needs of newly independent nations, leading to a shortage of skilled labor for local development. You see talented individuals leaving your land, seeking opportunities elsewhere, a constant reminder of the economic disparities created by the colonial past. The brutal force of the empire's military might, the relentless suppression of dissent, and the insidious erosion of your culture have left deep scars on your land and your people. But as the seasons turn, bringing with them the familiar rhythms of nature, a new, unseen enemy begins to emerge from the shadows of colonial rule. It is a silent killer, more pervasive than any musket, more devastating than any cannon. It is disease, and its arrival marks a new, horrifying chapter in the disturbing truth of the British Empire's colonies. The very concept of development itself, as understood in the post-colonial era, is often shaped by colonial models. The idea that progress means adopting Western industrial and economic models, rather than developing unique, indigenous paths to prosperity, is a powerful and often limiting legacy. The struggle for true self-determination involves not just political independence, but also the intellectual and economic freedom to define your own future, on your own terms. You've always known illness. Of course, the occasional fever, the seasonal cough, the dangers of childbirth. But your community has developed its own ways of coping, its own traditional remedies, its own wisdom passed down through generations. You understand the balance of health and sickness, the importance of clean water and a healthy diet. But now that balance is shattered, overwhelmed by a relentless tide of new ailments, illnesses that your healers have never encountered, diseases that sweep through your people with terrifying speed and lethality. You look at the faces of the younger generation, their eyes bright with hope and determination. They are inheriting a complex legacy, a world shaped by the shadows of empire. They carry the scars of the past, but they also possess the resilience, the creativity, and the unwavering spirit to build a better future. Their struggle is not just to overcome the challenges of the present, but to heal the wounds of the past, to reclaim what was lost, and to forge a destiny free from the lingering grip of colonial power. The first signs are subtle. A few individuals fall ill with strange fevers, their bodies racked with chills and aches. Then, more follow. The illness spreads rapidly through your cramped villages, through the crowded streets of the burgeoning colonial towns, through the labor camps and mines where people are packed together in unsanitary conditions. The traditional remedies, once effective against familiar ailments, prove useless against these new invaders. Your healers, once respected for their wisdom, stand helpless, their knowledge unable to stem the tide of suffering. Another gentle joke. If the British Empire had a legacy tour, it would probably involve a lot of awkward silences, some very uncomfortable questions, and definitely no gift shop. A common historical fact, often overlooked in the grand narratives of empire, is the devastating impact of introduced diseases on indigenous populations. European colonizers, unwittingly or not, brought with them a host of pathogens to which indigenous peoples had no natural immunity. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and cholera, which had long been endemic in Europe, became catastrophic epidemics in the colonies, wiping out entire communities and causing massive demographic collapse. It was like unleashing an invisible army, far more lethal than any human soldiers. As night falls and the stars emerge, you reflect on the immense and enduring legacy of the British Empire's colonies. The physical scars on the land, the broken economic systems, the fractured social structures, and the deep psychological wounds, all bear witness to a history of exploitation and oppression. But you also see the resilience of the human spirit, the unwavering determination to heal, to rebuild, to reclaim a future free from the shadows of the past. The journey into this disturbing truth has revealed the profound and lasting impact of colonialism, a story that continues to shape our world today. And here's a unique detail that highlights the tragic irony in some instances. Indigenous populations who had developed some resistance to certain local diseases found themselves completely vulnerable to the new European ones. Conversely, the Europeans sometimes struggled with tropical diseases that were endemic to the colonies, leading to high mortality rates among the colonizers as well, though rarely on the same scale as the indigenous populations. It's a grim reminder that disease doesn't pick sides, but its impact is often disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable. And so we come to the end of this journey. A journey through the dark corners of history where the light of progress is often eclipsed by the darkness of exploitation. You have seen ravaged forests, polluted rivers, suppressed cultures, and dispossessed people. You have felt the pain of racism, the brutality of hunger, and the injustice of a system built on domination. But in it all, you have also seen the resilience of the human spirit. Voices of resistance, however small, have been heard. Struggles, however arduous, have rekindled hope. And finally, abbas, however slow and arduous, the path to freedom has been paved. The scars of the past remain, etched in the land, in the memories, and in the souls of generations. But they are also reminders of resilience, of overcoming adversity, and of the never-ending desire for a more just world. The conditions imposed by colonial rule only exacerbate the spread of these diseases. The forced displacement of communities, crammed into overcrowded settlements, creates ideal breeding grounds for pathogens. The disruption of traditional agriculture and the imposition of cash crops lead to widespread malnutrition, weakening immune systems and making people more susceptible to illness. The lack of proper sanitation in the hastily built colonial towns, with open sewers and contaminated water sources, turns every settlement into a potential breeding ground for epidemics. Let these images fade from your mind, like clouds clearing after a storm. Remember, history is not just a dry book. It is the story of people, of struggles, of valuable lessons. And sometimes, the most disturbing truths are the ones we need to better understand the world we live in. You see the grim progression. A family member falls ill, their body racked with fever and chills. You try to care for them, to soothe their pain, but the disease is relentless. Soon, others in your household, then your neighbors, begin to show the same symptoms. The village, once vibrant with life, becomes a place of mourning, its silence broken only by the cries of the sick and the wails of the bereaved. The dead are buried quickly, often in mass graves, as there is simply no time or energy for traditional ceremonies.